Hi, my name is Will Randolph. Welcome back. This is the third video in a four-part series on the deepest revolution, co-creating a healthy nation. Today's theme is high standards, making trustworthy behavior normal. So to put us in the context here, this is a four-part series. The first video was an introduction to healthy nations in traditional times, right? I believe that when we look at healthy nations in traditional times, we're looking at a really different way of life compared to what you and I have now. It's not like communism versus capitalism or democracy versus monarchy. Like it is, there are really profound differences that allow people to live without corruption and greed and discrimination and all these troubles we're used to. So that first video is about that survey just to show, hey, this is real. And many, many, many observations from around the world show what this way of life is like. And then the later videos are drilling down into themes. And so video 2 was about living in reciprocity with a gift economy. What's it like to have a way of life based on sharing rather than trying to hoard your wealth and get rich, where generosity is encouraged instead of selfishness or greed? And what kinds of practices or attitudes could we learn to help us, people like you and me, embrace that way of life for ourselves? Today's theme is high standards, how we can make trustworthy behavior normal. And video 4 will be pathways to a healthy nation. We'll look at examples of people trapped in our way of life who came together, built a healthy nation, and were able to stop living this way, right? Stop having the endless corruption and greed within their nation and build a way of life where they could live respectfully with each other and with the earth. So today's overview to offer like what I'll be sharing on a broad level. I want to start with a review. If you haven't seen the other videos, that's totally okay. I will start with a review to catch up on the basics of these two ways of life as I see them. And if you have seen the other videos, well, you'll get a review. So we'll start with that. And then before I talk about this other beautiful way of life, I want to go a little bit into our way of life, right? I believe that you and I in an unhealthy nation are trapped in a way of life that causes endless corruption and greed. And so before we can understand this beautiful way of life, I think it's important to understand our current way so that we can understand the trap we're in. We can understand how we're trained to perpetuate it in different ways. And if we can really come from that space of self-awareness, that'll help us understand this beautiful way of life and really learn the deepest lessons to help make that our way of life. So it won't be too long, but we will go into this unhealthy nation section and talk about why untrustworthy behavior is so common. Then after that, we'll talk about building trust with imperfect people, how to have high standards and make trustworthy behavior normal, knowing that no one is perfect. So I want to start with the review. And in the first video, we did an exercise where I asked you to imagine what a totally trustworthy person is like. If you could imagine someone that you trusted in every way, what qualities would they need to show in order to be fully trustworthy? Not just a little bit or sometimes, but all the time in every way. And I'm showing on the screen here things that we brainstormed. One is different kinds of integrity, right? Always telling the truth, always keeping your promises, right? And acting in service. I actually consider that a kind of integrity, right? If I go to a doctor, I don't expect a doctor to make themselves as rich as possible off of me. I expect a doctor to take care of my health. If I'm a student at a college, I don't expect the college to make as much money off of me as they can. I expect them to aid my education, right? So we expect each other to act in service. It's a kind of trust we have. And so it's a kind of integrity. Confronting injustice. If this totally trustworthy person saw me being disrespected or hurt somehow, would they just ignore me? No, I don't think so. They would help me out. They would intervene somehow to stand up for what's right. And of course, if you're going to be a totally trustworthy person, You can't just tell the truth when you feel like it. And you can't just keep your promises when you feel like it. You got to do the right thing, even when it's scary or uncomfortable. And I consider that a form of bravery. And so we'll include that. Then there's what happens if I'm being physically attacked, right? Or someone's trying to rob me or mug me. Well, a totally trustworthy person, they wouldn't just turn tail and run and be glad it wasn't happening to them, right? They would come to my aid, right? They would protect me. Another theme is generosity, right? If I lost my job, I don't have food, I'm hungry. Would this totally trustworthy person, would they just let me starve and say, well, that's tough luck, you shouldn't have lost your job? Or would they share with me, right? They would share with me. And this totally trustworthy person, they don't just give, but because I don't just want to receive, right? I also want to give back to the people who give to me. And so if I never could give back to them, I'd have a really hard time being in a relationship. It'd be really weird and one-sided. And so I believe a totally trustworthy person would live in reciprocity with me, right? Where we're giving and receiving to each other over time. Another point, what if you could imagine people spreading rumors about you all through town? Some of them you knew and some of them were strangers, right? But they're spreading rumors about you that aren't true, and you start to feel insecure and a little bit scared because you can't control what other people do or say. You can't control what they believe. Would this totally trustworthy person, would they believe these rumors and just quietly stop hanging out with you? Or would they seek the truth? Would they come to you and ask you what happened? Not to blindly take sides, but to do their own investigation to find the truth. I think seeking the truth is something that this totally trustworthy person would do. And mistakes, no one's perfect, including this totally trustworthy person, right? So if they're totally trustworthy and they mess up, right? Maybe they break a promise. What would they do? Well, they would take accountability, wouldn't they? They would acknowledge what they did. They would acknowledge the broken promise. They would apologize. They would make up for any harm done, and then they would commit, to being reliable again, to keeping their promises, so that I could go back to trusting them, right? And what happens if I break a promise? What happens if I make a mistake? And I take accountability, right? I do all those same things. I acknowledge what I did wrong. I apologize and I find out the impact and I try to make, I do the whole thing. And this person, if they're totally trustworthy, would they just say, oh, I know who you really are. You can't fool me a second time. And would they turn their back on me? Or would they have compassion? Would they see that I'm a good person doing my best and I messed up, but I can grow from it? I believe they would have that compassion, right? They would see that I made a mistake and they would see that I'm fully owning it and that I'm growing from it, right? Another situation, if I'm really struggling in life, I am failing out of a class, I am stuck in a really bad relationship with someone who isn't good for me, or maybe I'm doing self-destructive drugs, would this person just be like, oh, well, I don't want to be around that person anymore? Or would they lift me up and bring out the best in me, help build my self-confidence, and help me see the beautiful life I could build? I believe a totally trustworthy person would bring out the best in me, right? Hold me to high standards so I can be my best self, right? Another question about this totally trustworthy person. Would this totally trustworthy person, would they spend their life mostly drunk, or mostly playing video games, or mostly chatting about professional sports or other meaningless things? Or would they be living a meaningful life, right? Where their work, their family life, whatever it is they're doing with their time matters to them in every moment. And I'm not saying they're serious all the time, because it's important to enjoy life. But I'm saying that they're not wasting their life, right? To me, I would say I would find someone totally trustworthy if they were living that meaningful life. And if they weren't, that would be a major cause for concern, right? So I'm sure we could list more things about a totally trustworthy person, but I think this list is a pretty good start, right? If someone's embracing all of these qualities with you consistently, I think they're doing pretty good, right? So, question for you. If you wanted a friend like this, what kind of friend would you need to be? That's right. You need to be the same kind of friend. If you wanted a friend this trustworthy, you would need to be this trustworthy, right? And you, um, if you need to treat someone else the way you want to be treated, what does that sound like? That's the golden rule, isn't it? To treat someone else the way you want to be treated. Well, I think that is basically what human trust is. Human trust, or our desire to trust, is our desire to trust other people to fully embrace the golden rule, right? And so to fully trust someone, another person has to be fully trustworthy, which means they fully embrace the golden rule. And so if we could imagine a whole nation of people where you had this kind of deep trust in everybody, what would that be like? You know, what way of life would allow people to have deep trust in their neighbors and leaders? I believe it's a way of life where everyone in the whole nation, it fully embraces the golden rule. And that means you're not just allowed to share, everyone is expected to share. You're not just allowed to confront injustice. Everyone is expected to confront injustice. And at this point, I have studied dozens and dozens of healthy nations in traditional times. And they all have their differences, different languages, skin color, food, right? There's all these differences. But if we look deep down at a few common things that they all share that allow them to live in a beautiful way, I want to show what those are that allow people to live without the corruption and greed. Excuse me. One is that everyone ensures the laws work for everybody, right? So everyone takes that responsibility to make sure that what we're doing works for everyone. Solidarity and mutual aid are normal, right? Everyone is expected to protect and share with each other. And everyone is expected to confront injustice so that justice becomes normal. And leaders are fully accountable to the people. So examples of this, of healthy nations, are the Potawatomi, the Apache, and the Ashaninka. The Ashaninka are able to live this way right now. I lived with them in 2015 for a brief time, and I got to see this way of life for myself and experience it, and it totally transformed my life. It showed me what's possible. The Apache and the Potawatomi are not able to live this way now. It has been, give or take, about 150-ish years. But people from these nations are still alive today, and many of them are carrying on this traditional knowledge that, if we're willing to listen, can show us what this way of life is like. So these people are called Indians, Native people, Indigenous people. In Canada, they're called First Nations. In Australia, they're Aborigines, right? I call them healthy nations. I also call them free nations when they're able to live in traditional times. So if there's this beautiful way of life, if this is really real, and it lets people live in a beautiful way with each other indefinitely, what is this other way of life that you and I are stuck in, such that we have endless corruption and greed? Well, if we look at unhealthy nations around the world, right, white or black, capitalism or communism, big or small, right, but the countries or the nations that have endless corruption and greed, we see a few things in common. So what is it about this way of life that causes so many problems? A few people choose the laws and choose how they're enforced, and everyone else obeys, right? A king might make the laws and you obey. Maybe you cast a ballot and then some corrupt politicians get into office and make the laws and you obey, right? Either way, it's the same basic way of life. We're not allowed to enforce the laws that we're given, right? That we have to obey. And that means we are forbidden to confront injustice. If someone else is doing something really inappropriate, I'm allowed to call the police, but I'm not allowed to physically intervene because enforcing the law is the police's job, and I am not allowed. And that means it's illegal to fully embrace the golden rule, right? Where each person is treating the others the way they want to be treated, right? Protecting each other from injustice is not allowed. Examples of this way of life are Russia, Ecuador, the United States, Japan, China. There are many others, right? These are also called civilized nations, and I also call them unfree nations, right? Which this gets to the heart of what freedom even means. being free doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. Freedom is a way of life where everyone in the nation shares so that sharing is normal, right? Freedom is a way of life where everyone in the nation takes responsibility to confront injustice so that justice is normal, right? I believe ultimately freedom is a way of life where everyone in the nation embraces the golden rule. In other words, this is how healthy nations live or lived in traditional times. So I believe these are really two deeply different ways of life. And like I said a moment ago, I want to really focus on the beautiful way of life because so many people are unfamiliar with it and it has so many deep lessons to teach. So most of the time I want to talk about these stories and these lessons. But before we do, I want to talk about this way of life that we have, because if we're not clear on our own way of life, well, how can we embrace this other one that's so different? And especially because I believe that we are actually trained to tolerate injustice. And if we're not clear on that training, well, we might not be able to break out of it. So I believe in healthy nations, everyone is expected to confront injustice, whereas in unhealthy nations, people are expected not to confront injustice. It is illegal to uphold the law, right? Because it's the police's job. So only police can enforce the law, but they have to follow orders too, right? So if the police don't enforce the law, or if they enforce it unfairly, or what if the police break the law? Tough luck. And there was this Sioux man named Sitting Bull, and he gave a speech in 1883, and he said, "The life of white men is slavery. They are prisoners in their towns or farms. The life my people want is freedom," right? Sitting Bull grew up in a traditional way, and his people were no longer able to maintain that after the Americans forced them onto reservations, right? He recognized that our way of life is not freedom, but his traditional way was. So what I'd like to talk about is how are we trained to perpetuate this way of life? How are we trained to tolerate injustice instead of consistently confronting it so that we can have a beautiful way of life? And to give an example of how we're trained to tolerate injustice, I want to offer a description of the American so-called justice system, right? If you could imagine massive injustices happening all around you, people being tortured, people being disrespected, profoundly abused by the millions all around you, and you didn't even notice it, right? How crazy would that be, right? The newspapers aren't talking about it. The politicians aren't debating it, right? You can't vote for anyone that's going to change it because it's just happening in the background. It's just part of our normal way of life, right? Wouldn't that be insane? I want to give you an example. Let's talk about the American justice system. And I'm not going to talk about citations right now, but I've written 2 books. The Deepest Revolution is where I recommend people start, but between the 2 of them, they have citations for everything I'm about to share. There's this belief in America that we have the rule of law, and if you get accused of a crime, you go to court, you get an attorney, and you get a chance to defend yourself by presenting all the evidence proving your innocence. And a jury, of an impartial jury, decides if you're really innocent or not, right? That is not how it works. Literally 2% of federal inmates actually got to present evidence in defense of themselves at trial. 98% of federal inmates did not defend themselves at trial, but they're in jail anyway. How crazy is that? The trial is how the public knows if the person was guilty of something, which means that since we never got to see the evidence as the public has no idea if 98% of the federal inmates in this country are guilty of anything. Isn't that crazy? And the reason is plea bargaining, right? So what happens is the prosecutors will threaten the defendant with like 20 or 50 years in jail, some huge amount of time, and then say, look, if you admit your guilt, you can go to jail for just a few months or 3, 4, 5 years. But you definitely won't be in jail for 50. And so a lot of people will take that offer, right? What if my judge isn't fair? What if a witness lies on the stand? What if my lawyer doesn't care? What if I lose the trial and I end up in jail for 50 years, right? So that people will end up taking 2 or 5 or 10 years just to protect themselves from that other possibility. So we have a huge number of people in prison who aren't even guilty of anything. I'm not saying 98%, but what I'm saying is we don't know as the public because we didn't get to see that evidence. So another factor is that prisoners can legally be forced to work, and this is constitutional. It's in one of the amendments, 13th or 14th, right, that outlawed slavery. But people can be forced to work if they were convicted of a crime, right? So now we're talking about a system of prison slavery, right? Just like chattel slavery, people were kidnapped at random and put to work, right, without any meaningful justification. Well, we have 98% of the prisoners in this country, federal prisoners, in jail, who knows why, and they're put to work. But it gets worse. So, prison sexual assault is, a lot of people will crack jokes, don't drop the soap. There was a survey in 1 year that I've been able to find of sexual assault in prisons, right? Most of the time, when you look at the sexual assault statistics for the whole country, it'll say, it'll describe all the sexual assault everywhere in churches and schools and homes, right, in cars. And the vast majority of sexual assault victims in these contexts are women, right? And so the stats show that way more women than men are sexually assaulted in this country. But if you look in the fine print of those surveys, or of the federal research reports, they say that these numbers don't include prisons or military bases. But what happens if you include prisons in the statistics? Well, I found in 2008 the federal report that showed these numbers, and the results are staggering. There is so much sexual assault in the prison system in this country that if you compare men and women overall, if you combine the prison and non-prison populations, there are more male victim sexual assaults than female victim. And I want to be crystal clear, women suffer terribly in this country and in every unhealthy nation, right? There's terrible sexism. Every sexual assault is inappropriate. I don't mean to diminish anybody's experience or take away from anybody's effort to achieve change, right? Women suffer terribly, and I don't mean to take away anything from that. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of, like, the suffering isn't as asymmetric as we think. Everybody is suffering in different ways in this way of life. And if you didn't know about this already, that just shows how we can just go on through our life not even being aware of how much injustice is happening all around, right? People aren't even talking about this, even though it is epic levels of injustice. So I want to give an example. A lot of people would say, oh, well, there's some bad apples. Maybe there's a lot of bad apples in the prison system. But is the system really bad? Is the barrel of apples rotten? And I want to say yes. And I want to give an example from the war on drugs, right? The war on drugs is a roughly 50-year-old federal project to fight drug use by arresting drug dealers and arresting drug users. And the idea is to keep us safe from all the, bad drug users, drug dealers who, commit all these crimes to get the drugs, to get money to get drugs. So the idea is it's a public safety program, right? That is a total lie, and it has always been a total lie. In 1994, a man named John Ehrlichman gave an interview to a journalist. Now, John Ehrlichman was a attorney in the White House during the Nixon administration. And so he was on board when the war on drugs was started, right? And so this journalist goes to this guy, John Ehrlichman. He's like, I have all these questions about drug policy, and I'm trying to figure out these things that don't work. And John Ehrlichman is like, you're asked, and I'm paraphrasing this part, he's like, let me tell you what's real. And now I'm going to quote you what he said. The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the Vietnam War or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. right? So they knew, right? The officials in charge knew they were living a lie, right? They were building an entire program, a federal program, on a lie that has put literally millions of people in prison on these made up reasons, right? For decades, right? I'm not saying they weren't using drugs necessarily, but the whole war on drugs, the reason it even started was to persecute anti-war activists who were trying to stop unjust wars, right? And it was to persecute black people who were trying to stop racist government activities, right? So this whole war on drugs is a gigantic scam that we have been living with for decades. And this, again, is the American justice system at work. So you might say, well, surely the police would have enough integrity to stand up to this, and they would never be part of such a scam. And the tragic truth is that police deceit is common. And there have been many academic studies that where people will interview the police officers, the attorneys, and the judges themselves, and they'll ask them about the issue of police integrity or perjury in the trials. And the consistent response is that deceit is actually common. And just one easy example I can give is that in New York City, they created their own term, testifying, which is a combination of testify and lying, right? Because it's so common, right? And so there's low integrity is a problem, right? And surely you would say, well, there's a lot of honest police officers, right? So I would say that's true, right? There are many police officers with integrity who try and stand up for what's right, who confront their own police department's illegal behavior. And what happens to them? Police whistleblowers are consistently punished. The USA Today, the newspaper, did some research, and they built this database of around 300 examples of police whistleblowers. And in every single example that I saw, the police officers who tried to stand up for what's right were heavily punished. They maybe lost their career, they may have had their lives threatened, and there's plenty of testimony showing this. And some of them even had to leave their home or even leave the state, right, to protect their family. So why? I believe we are trapped in a way of life with unaccountable political leaders who won't let honest police get in the way of their policies, right? So the result of this is endless injustice, like in every unhealthy nation, right? And so why highlight this? Again, these things aren't really front page news. I don't see them on the news. I don't see them on TV. I go to different meetings. People aren't talking about these things. This is just background noise that people have learned to tolerate, even though it is massive, epic injustice. So if you and your trusted friends personally intervened to ensure justice, what would happen? You would be punished, right? Because only the police can enforce the law. And this is why Sitting Bull called us prisoners and slaves, right? If you think about, when I first read this, I was like, how can I be a prisoner, right? I'm a middle-class white guy. But then I realized what he was talking about, right? If you imagine, if you and I are in prison cells across the hall from each other, and the prison guards go into your cell and they start beating you up, right? I can witness the injustice, but I can't do anything about it, right? I'm stuck in my prison cell. Well, this is our way of life, right? You and me, we can acknowledge this injustice that all these people are experiencing, but we're not allowed to do anything about it because we're not allowed to enforce the law and we're not allowed to intervene in the legal system or we'd be heavily punished, right? So it's our way of life that Sitting Bull was talking about that produces endless slavery, where we are prisoners in our towns and farms. So what does this mean? Well, when people are forbidden from confronting injustice, then the result is widespread abuse, greed, and exploitation, right? We have poisons, all these synthetic chemicals in our food, water, clothing, building supplies. We have unjust wars where the poor people die and the rich people get even richer. We have untrustworthy news media. We have pollution. We have endless climate change, mass extinction. We have soil loss, right? With no end in sight. So what happens personally when bravely confronting injustice is forbidden? Well, cowardice and superficiality become normal. This isn't just a problem in Americans. It's not just a problem in one skin color or one sex. It's common in unhealthy nations. And so, what does that look like? How does that cowardice and superficiality show up? People playing huge amounts of video games, gambling, overworking, or trying to get rich because they don't know what else to do with their life, alcohol and drug abuse, shame, guilt, low self-esteem, TV and internet distractions, domestic violence and child abuse, right? As people who are abused commonly abuse their own children. And why does that happen so much? Well, we're in a society with a lot of abuse and not much accountability, right? So people obeying laws created by corrupt politicians and thinking that that's okay. Needing antidepressant drugs. Women asking, where are all the good men? Right? I've heard this a bunch in the United States, and I've found examples from lots of unhealthy nations around the world. But women don't ask this in healthy nations in traditional times, right? But when we're trained for cowardice and superficiality and low integrity, it becomes a problem, right? This is our way of life, right? When bravely confronting injustice is forbidden, all these other problems show up in all these terrible ways. But it doesn't have to be this way. And that's why right now I want to switch over and talk about a way of life based on the golden rule. If we can have a way of life where everyone is expected to confront injustice, where everyone is expected to have integrity and bravery and generosity with each other, what does that way of life look like? And what specific things could we learn that would help us make that our way of life? So I want to offer some perspectives I've learned from the Haudenosaunee that really showed me what's possible here. In this book, Basic Call to Consciousness, many different Haudenosaunee writers put it together. And they say that they have something called the Great Law of Peace, which my interpretation is it's kind of like a constitution. It's like the basic thing, right, that other laws build on. But they say this: their society was founded on concepts of moral justice, not statute law, right? And that's a quote. And when I read that, I was like, what? How do you have a society founded on justice, right? Don't you need law to like have agreements that we all agree to? But I kept reading, and this took me many years to figure these things out. But what they said is if absolute justice was established in the world, peace would naturally follow. And I was like, well, that makes sense, right? If there's absolute justice, well, then there's no injustice, and so there's nothing to be upset about. So it makes sense that people would get along, right? And then they said that universal justice is the product of a spiritually strong society. And I was like, that's interesting. What does that mean? Well, let's work backwards. We want peace within our nation, right? We can't control if there's war outside, with an external enemy, but within the nation, we can we can choose, we can want peace. We can want respectful relations with each other, right? So in order to get peace, we need universal justice, right? This is what the Haudenosaunee writers were just saying, right? And if we want universal justice, what do we need? A spiritually strong society. So this is how one thing leads to the next, and ultimately a beautiful way of life, right? So what they said is that many of the rules are designed to create a strong society rather than a strong government, right? Building up that spiritual strength. And they said our culture requires that every individual live in service to the spiritual ways and the people, right? It's not optional. It's expected that everybody have this spiritual strength to build this beautiful way of life together. So I'm going to shift over here. I've been showing quotes from these Haudenosaunee writers, and I want to just share the lessons I'm learning, right? But what I'm saying now isn't from them. I'm not a Haudenosaunee person, right? So I want to make that distinction. But I want to share some lessons that I'm taking away from this. I believe a spiritually strong society is one where everyone is expected to embrace the golden rule, treating others as he or she would want to be treated. And I also believe it extends to the earth, right? If we're going to receive gifts from the earth, we'd better give gifts back and build the abundance that we live with. But in this video, I want to focus on trust between people as well. So if a spiritually strong society is one where everyone is expected to embrace the golden rule, well, what does that mean for spiritual strength? What is spiritual strength? If we could even put words to something like that. Well, every society that I've ever studied, healthy or unhealthy, has a concept of the golden rule, right? Christians have it, Muslims have it, Buddhists have it, pagans, everywhere you look. People have some concept of the golden rule. And I believe it's because that is the kind of society as humans we evolved to live in, and it's what we still expect deep down. So I believe a person with spiritual strength is someone who fully embraces the golden rule with people they love. And another way of putting this is a person with spiritual strength is profoundly trustworthy. And another way of putting this is a person with spiritual strength has high standards. So I believe these are all different ways of saying the same thing, right? They're different ways of trying to get at the same basic idea, right? Of how we could relate to each other and what it would take, what qualities we would need to cultivate in order to be able to do that. So what are these high standards? Well, it's all the stuff I talked about a moment ago, those aspects of being trustworthy, right? Integrity, bravery, generosity, accountability, awareness, compassion, bringing out the best in each other, serving each other, and serving the earth. And of course, I'm sure there's more. I'm not saying this is a complete list, but I think it's a pretty good start. So what does all that mean? Well, I believe the path to co-creating a healthy nation and the path to freedom involve helping each other grow spiritually so we can deeply trust each other, right? If this is a way of life where people can trust each other deeply because trustworthy behavior is normal, then we get to figure out how to raise our standards, how to build deep relationships where trust is normal, because within our relationships, trustworthy behavior is normal. So what I've learned about this is that if I want to have deep trust relationships, it starts with me. The golden rule says to treat others the way I want to be treated. And if I want my friend or my partner to always tell the truth, well, I need to always tell the truth. If I want someone to keep their promises, I need to always keep my promises. If I want my neighbors to care about the earth, I better care about the earth, right? So the first step, I believe, to having high standards with someone else is to hold myself to high standards of trustworthy behavior, knowing that I'm imperfect. And this brings up a big question. How can you deeply trust someone if no one is perfect, right? I'm not perfect. No one's perfect. People in healthy nations in traditional times, they were human beings too, right? No one's perfect. So how can we have deep trust in each other if no one's perfect? Well, I have a request for you. And I would like to describe two different people, right? And I want you to think to yourself, which person would you consider more trustworthy? So let's talk about this first person. Let's look at one person and see how trustworthy you think they are. This person tries to please people and make everyone happy. They never make clear promises and they speak in vague ways, so they're kind of hard to pin down. They only say nice things and try to avoid conflict. And they have poor eye contact and they slump a lot, right? So think of how trustworthy you would consider this person. And let's look at someone else. Another person consistently says what they believe, authentically sharing their feelings. They make clear promises and they commonly keep them, except once recently they broke a promise. And when they broke that promise recently, they looked you in the eye and they acknowledged the broken promise. They acknowledged the negative impact it had, and they voluntarily made up for any harm done as much as they could. And then they recommitted to always keeping their promises, right? So which person is more trustworthy, the vague people pleaser or the person who takes full accountability for their mistakes. Everyone I've ever talked to, and me as well, we pick the person on the right? The person who made a mistake, but when they make a mistake, they take full accountability for it, right? So that to me is amazing, right? How can you deeply trust someone if no one is perfect? Well, there's really good news. You don't need to be perfect to be trustworthy. I believe a trustworthy person is sincerely dedicated to their spiritual growth, right? What does that mean, right? They hold themselves to high standards for things like integrity and generosity and other qualities. And they grow from their mistakes. When they mess up, they tell a lie, they break a promise, they hoard for themselves when, they could have shared. They hold themselves accountable and they acknowledge what they did and they grow from it, right? So let's look at these two groups of people in a little more detail, right? Let's look at the nice people pleaser and let's look at the trustworthy person and look at what these, like all the people pleasers usually have in common. And let's look at what the trustworthy people, what they have in common. And I want to start this off by saying I am a recovering people pleaser. I'm not 100% done, but I've made some strides. And so what I'm sharing here is from years of me building my own self-awareness and also from observing lots of other people pleasers and trustworthy people, and also reading a huge amount of books on these things. So what are some common patterns of people pleasers and common patterns of trustworthy people? The people pleaser is commonly insecure or has low self-confidence, whereas the trustworthy person is commonly secure or has self-confidence. The people pleaser is commonly afraid to make mistakes, whereas the trustworthy person isn't afraid to make mistakes. They don't want to make mistakes. They try not to make mistakes, but they're not afraid of it, right? Which is different. The people pleaser will try to be good and avoid being bad, right? Whereas the trustworthy person knows they're a good person who sometimes makes mistakes, right? I'm a good person whether I'm making a mistake right now or not. But I might be making a mistake. And if I am making a mistake, I'd better learn from that so I don't do it again. The nice people pleaser will often feel intense shame or guilt about their mistakes, whereas the trustworthy person will feel disappointed at mistakes they make, but they focus on what to learn so they don't do it again. The people pleaser doesn't trust others to see their growth, whereas the trustworthy person trusts others to see their growth. It's one reason they're not so afraid of making mistakes, because they trust that, well, I'll grow from this. My friends will forgive me when they see my personal growth, when I try to make it right, and we'll just keep on going on as friends, right? They trust others to see their personal growth. So the people pleaser, when you really dig down into it, they're committed to staying out of trouble, to pleasing others, or some kind of selfishness, right? Focused on themselves in some way, even though it looks like they're trying to please others. The trustworthy person is committed to spiritual growth in the sense that I described a moment ago. So in a moment, like what I'm really excited to talk about is how can we build each other up to make trustworthy behavior normal. And most of the rest of this talk, I want to focus on that. But at this point, I want to take a deep dive into people pleasers for a couple minutes, because I gave this talk a few days ago. And at the end of this talk, a woman came on and she asked some really good questions about people pleasers. She didn't seem to think it was that bad. Like, what's the matter with helping each other feel happy? I want to take a moment to address those. Let's talk about people pleasers. So one question she had was, well, there's so many people doing really terrible things in the world. People who will kill someone else for profit, right? People who will dump toxins in the river knowing all the harm it'll cause and being like, well, I'm glad I'm making my money, right? There's so many people lying and cheating, like knowing they're doing terrible things. Why are you picking on people pleasers? Great question. And the reality is that there are many different ways of being untrustworthy with each other. And a lot of those things are just sort of obviously untrustworthy, right? But people pleasers, I believe most of the people watching this video will recognize those other people as untrustworthy. We don't have to talk about that. But I believe a lot of people don't recognize that people pleasers are actually untrustworthy. And also many people will think, well, aren't we supposed to help each other be happy? Like, aren't we supposed to avoid conflict? Why not make people happy, right? And the reality, I believe, again, and I'll get to examples, is that what we actually want deep down is to trust each other, right? If I'm not honest with you, or if I'm not keeping my promises, but I'm trying to make you happy, ultimately it turns into emotional manipulation, right? We don't really feel safe with the other person. What would actually help one person feel safe with another? To have deep trust, right? And so, as an example, I was at a party recently, and this woman was talking about being grateful not to be surrounded by toxic masculinity and all this machismo, right? But there were plenty of people pleasers around her, right? Who also aren't trustworthy in their own ways, right? So people can see one kind of untrustworthy behavior, but they won't notice the other in the same way. So, um, I want to give an example, right? If I'm trying to please someone, well, how is that untrustworthy? Like, what's the problem if we're all, happy with each other and focused on making each other happy? I want to give an example. And this isn't a real example from my personal life, but it's a scenario that's has parts of my history and parts of many other people pleasers' histories. Let's just think through how this works and how someone who's trying to make people happy can actually cause huge problems and deep distrust. So let's imagine that I am me and you are my girlfriend, and we see each other a few times a week. And I'm a people pleaser in this scenario. And so my focus is on minimizing conflict, on keeping the peace, avoiding trouble, keeping people happy. Sounds nice, right? Well, let's imagine that as we spend time together, I notice you sometimes don't clean up after yourself in the kitchen. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But I don't say anything about it because I want to avoid conflict. I just want to have a good time and keep the peace, right? But I start to feel resentful, but I don't tell you about it. And then over time, I notice, when it's time to make dinner or decide where to go out for dinner, I let you choose what we eat, right? And I just say, I'm fine with anything. I just want to make you happy, right? But then oftentimes I don't end up enjoying where we go, or I don't end up enjoying what we have for dinner, right? And I start to feel resentful because I don't get what I want very much, right? But I don't own that. I'm starting to get resentful. The frustration is building up, but I'm not telling you about it. I could just say, hey, I don't feel like Chinese. How would you feel about blah, 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 right? We could have these conversations. They don't have to be a big deal. But because I'm a people pleaser, I'm not expressing myself in these ways, right? So let's give another example. Let's say we're talking about where to live together. And I say, where would you like? Oh, you want to be over there? Let's do that. If that makes you happy, let's do that. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, really doesn't work for me, right? So let's say we go move there, and now I'm living in a place that's really terrible for me. I have a long commute. I don't have any friends. Life is rough. So I'm building up these frustrations, right? Because I'm not telling you how I feel. I'm not willing to confront your, hurtful behavior, right? Like leaving a mess is very minor, but it's an example of not being willing to confront something that's not working, right? So I keep pleasing you. And what's happening? Well, I start to build up stress, and you come to me and you say, hey, I notice you're feeling stressful and things are a little weird. Are you okay? And I'm like, no, dear, everything's great. I love being with you, right? If I'm not willing to, if I'm focused on keeping everything smooth and happy and keeping you happy, I'm not going to tell you the truth. I'm going to try and make you happy, right? That's the people-pleasing attitude. And so the frustration and maybe even anger, disappointment, whatever, like that's all still there. It's building up, and maybe the other person can even see something's going on. But even if they try to deal with it, because I'm not fully self-aware and I'm not expressing myself, I'm not, I don't have the strength to speak to these things. We can't deal with it, right? So I'm already not being honest, right? Because you asked me how I felt. I'm not even telling you the truth about how I feel, right? So we already have dishonesty, discomfort. We have separation from each other. If I'm not taking responsibility for myself, well, I might just keep building up this frustration and this tension and not feeling good about this relationship. What would I do as a people pleaser? Well, I might decide that you're the problem, right? We always go to where she wants for dinner. Where we're living, that's her choice, right? She didn't ask me what I wanted, right? And maybe you did one time, but I forgot, right? But I have these stories because I'm not willing to confront these things that aren't working for me. And so ultimately, I could spread rumors to other people about how bad a partner you are, right? Because ultimately, I'm not willing to play my part in the relationship. I might decide that the only thing I can do to release these frustrations is leave the relationship, right? When we could have just had a couple conversations and it wouldn't have been a big deal, right? So over and over, it turns out just trying to please someone is actually not trustworthy. And I believe what we want as people is this foundation of deep trust. So let's talk about for a second, why is people pleasing so common? Well, again, we have a society where a few people make the laws and everyone else has to obey, whether you like them or not. So what does that mean? It means we're trained for obedience, right? So imagine a child and how children are trained for obedience and what effect that has on us emotionally and spiritually. Well, if you're punished every time you're disobedient, then, whether you like the rules or not, well, what do you learn as a kid? To please the authority figures, right? You're trying to please the people who could get you in trouble or, who are important people in your life in some way. Oftentimes, authority figures aren't fair, right? They don't hold appropriate boundaries. And so it's not about right and wrong. It's about keeping the authority figure happy, whether it's a parent or a teacher or a church minister or whatever. And often many people in a kid's life are the same way. And so you might be beaten if you're disobedient, or you might be told God, doesn't love you and this is sinful and this is the devil in you, right? So maybe you're scared of making a mistake and you don't ever want to make a mistake and you just want to be good, right? To avoid all those, the punishment. Or maybe you're worried about the God, the Jesus, the shame, right? You don't want to be shamed. You don't want God to see these imperfect parts of you. So you want to be good, right? And what do these do? What is the result of raising children in this way? Deep insecurity, right? The shame and the guilt, right? We end up, instead of having the spiritual strength to stand for what's right, we wind up pleasing the authority figures. And then in adulthood, well, your partner, you sort of relate to that person as an authority figure, right? As someone to please, to keep your life situation going the way it is, right? It's just sort of the default that people can fall into. And I want to say one more thing about this. To show why I'm so passionate about this. This is not a small problem. It is a massive problem, and I want to give an example from history. So there's this woman named Hannah Arendt, and she was really curious why people could, what makes people do really terrible things to each other? Like, what could cause someone to want to kill millions of people and actually do it, right? So she looked into Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And she actually got to go to a trial of a Nazi government official named Eichmann, who was in charge of implementing the so-called final solution, right? The German government decided they wanted to kill millions of people, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, labor activists, lots of people from other countries, right? And it was this person's job, right, their government job, to organize the mass killing of millions of people, right? Moving the police around, moving the resources, the logistics to make all this work, making sure that trains were taking people where they needed to go, the prisons were ready to receive them, right? It was his job to oversee the entire killing operation for millions of people. And after World War II, a few years later, the Israelis actually kidnapped this guy where he was living and took him and put him on trial. Hannah Arendt went to watch the trial of this guy. And a lot of people might think, oh, wow, this guy killed millions of people. He must be a super villain. Like you think of someone from a comic book, right? Someone who's, they're super smart and they're super driven and they're super capable, right? And they're passionate about what they're doing. They believe in what they're doing, even if it's just selfish, right? That monster perspective is like a common belief. And Hannah Arendt said really explicitly, this guy isn't a monster. He's a clown. This guy is a joke. What she said about him is she called him a joiner, right? Which is like a follower, or what I would call a people pleaser. This guy didn't stand for anything. She said over and over, she gave all these examples where this man would make very principled statements in the courtroom, and then literally minutes later, he would contradict his own uh, principles, supposed, right? He would say that no one should ever demand mercy or forgiveness, right? And then a few minutes later, he would pass a note to the judge begging for forgiveness, right? He didn't have principles. And what he said was amazing. This guy said, remember, he was the top dog responsible for killing millions of people. And I want you to see how empty this man was. He said that the hardest thing for him was when the Nazi German government fell, because he had spent his entire life being told what to do. And all of a sudden, there wasn't anyone to tell him what to do. And he didn't know what to do with his life, right? He didn't kill millions of people because he had carefully studied the world and decided that if we do this, everything will work out okay and we can have a healthy society. Mm-mm. He was an empty man. His soul had been crushed, probably as a boy, right? So that he didn't have his own meaningful direction. He didn't stand for anything, right? When someone stopped giving him orders, he was totally lost, right? And that's why she called him a joiner. He was just going along. If he was alive right now and somewhere in the United States, he probably could be some manager at some small company, not causing any problems at all, right? Because he's just a leaf on the river, going wherever life takes him. And he just happened to join the Nazis and just happened to be put in this position where he could use his intelligence, to lead the effort to kill millions, right? But if we look at the training that caused it, he was just a people pleaser. And so understanding this people pleaser quality is really important, because this gets to the heart of the unhealthy nation we're part of, where people are trained for obedience. And oftentimes the people who do the most harm in the world are not passionate, aware, competent people. They're profoundly insecure. And that is actually how I believe we're trained for obedience, is we're trained for insecurity the vast majority of the time. So that said, if, we could talk about people pleasers all day long, but what I would like to talk about is holding each other to high standards. And if we're going to help each other become profoundly trustworthy, to grow out of these patterns, well, that means we've got to learn how to encourage these qualities, right? How can we help each other become self-confident, not afraid to make mistakes, to know we're a good person no matter what, to feel disappointed but not shame, right? To trust others, right? How can we help each other and build each other up in these ways? Well, I want to share some things I've learned, a lot of things from Healthy Nations, and then some other things from other mentors, because what I learned in life is that in my past, I used to do things that actually made it harder for me to take accountability or to show up in a trustworthy way. And even worse, I was doing and saying things that made it harder for other people to show up in a good way. And so what I'd like to do is share these perspectives I've found that I have really helped me become more trustworthy, and also raise up the people around me. And I hope they can help you too. So, how to help each other become deeply trustworthy? Well, when a friend or a loved one makes a mistake, such as lying, and this also applies for me too, but when someone makes a mistake, the first thing I do is I see if I need to build up their self-confidence or their self-worth. So I tell the person, you matter. The choices you make matter, right? If you tell a lie or you tell the truth, it makes a difference in the lives of people who care about you. If it didn't matter, then do whatever you want, right? Go ahead and lie if it doesn't matter. But the truth is, it does matter, right? It affects people. And so that's the first thing I do. And if the person already gets it, I might skip the step. But if they have low self-confidence or low self-worth, the first thing I do is I remind them that you matter. And I say that we are good people making mistakes. You are a good person. There's no shame, there's no guilt, there's no sin, right? You're a good person even when you mess up. You did make a mistake, but you're still a good person throughout, right? So feeling disappointed is okay, but I never shame or guilt anybody. I never say that you're inherently bad or not good enough, or you're unlovable, or you're just a dishonest person, or all men are this way, or white people are always this way, right? It's not an inherent problem, right? If I was a bad person, I can't change who I am. But if I'm a good person making a mistake, well, I can stop making mistakes, right? It's a totally different approach. And so that's what I help people see. You're a good person and you made a mistake. And so I don't make it harder than necessary for the person to take accountability. The next thing is to have high standards, right? Actually address the untrustworthy behavior. This is huge, and I cannot emphasize this too much. Expect trustworthy behavior from the people around you. Don't accept excuses because of sex or skin color or other reasons, right? I was talking with a woman recently who was being mistreated by this man in her life, and she believed that it was normal and just the way things are, that he could keep bothering her and that she would have to keep telling him, no, leave me alone. And she was just doing this over and over. And I said, no, you should expect him to honor your boundaries. And you should have to tell him no a single time, if that, right? And when I told her this, her eyes got wide. She's like, you're right. I shouldn't have to tell him over and over and over, right? He should be trustworthy. I shouldn't have to keep pushing him away, right? So let's expect trustworthy behavior, right? Don't ignore untrustworthy behavior just to try to get along, right? What that means when you do that is you're tolerating distrust, your own distrust, and you're tolerating their untrustworthy behavior. And when you do that, your frustration or your distrust will only grow, right? Because the hurtful behavior continues. So, another big thing is to seek out the full truth with an open mind and careful listening, right? Don't make any assumptions because it only makes the accountability more tricky. But if you really seek out the truth, it makes a big difference. And then another big thing here is speak to the kind of relationship you want, right? A lot of people, they come with a defensiveness. I'll get into this, and they don't trust other people, right? So if I can say, look, I'm not asking anything of you that I don't ask of myself, right? I want you to trust me. And that means I need to be able to trust you. And that means that, it's important to take accountability for the mistake. And the next big thing is to have a path back to grace, right? What does that mean? It means that when you approach this person, know what kinds of words or actions you want to see to resume trusting them. What would they need to say or do that you could notice and be like, that's excellent. I see you're on a good path. I'm willing to stay friends with you or to resume trusting you, right? A lot of people, they'll avoid addressing untrustworthy behavior because they don't know what to do about it. They don't want to cause a conflict and just be angry at each other, so they just try and ignore it and keep things pleasant. Other people will dive in and say, you're such and such a bad person and you shouldn't treat people this way, and God doesn't, God hates you when, when you're being sinful, right? What happens? Neither of those help get to accountability, right? So what helped me is to have a plan. What am I looking for, right? When I make a mistake, how do I take accountability? When someone else makes a mistake, how do I help them take accountability, right? If they don't know how to take accountability, you may need to teach them, right? And that's just a role that you'll have to accept. If you want them to take accountability and they don't know how, well, someone's got to teach them. And that's a way that you can lift them up, right? Help raise their standards, right? Help them take accountability. So I want to offer a really simple system that I use. It can be a little cookie cutter, so make it your own, right? Add a step if you want to adjust things, right? Every situation is different, but it helps me a lot to go into everything with a plan that I can work off of. So I want to offer this thing I call return to integrity. What does that mean? Well, if you and I are in integrity, right, we're totally honest and trustworthy with each other. If I'm out of integrity, it means I've somehow been untrustworthy with you. I broke a promise, or maybe I lied to you, right? Well, let's say I lied to you and I'm out of integrity. How do I get back into integrity? Well, I'm honest now about my past lie, right? So returning to integrity is now we're resuming being trustworthy with each other by acknowledging the problem that just happened, right? So I'm honest now about the past dishonesty. I try to make up for it. and I commit to growing from it, right? So the first step, acknowledge the mistake, right? The lie or stealing or breaking a promise. Acknowledge the impact on others. How was it hurtful? What was the harm? Make up for the harm as best I can, and then recommit to integrity or recommit to being trustworthy and learning the lessons I need to learn, right? If I'm the one that messed up, I go through this process. If someone else messed up in one way or another, I try to help them go through the process. And I don't always verbalize every step, right? I don't list out all the lessons necessarily. Maybe they don't want to hear. But I learn the lessons and I make sure that I do that. So the last big theme I want to cover here is practicing bravery. And this, I cannot overemphasize the importance of this either. Helping a person face their untrustworthy behavior can be scary and uncomfortable, right? That you may encounter fear, excuses, avoidance, distrust, insecurity, defensiveness. They could lash out at you and tell you what kind of person you are, and they could bring up unrelated topics and try to distract you, right? All these different things can be really uncomfortable, right? And make it really hard to have a productive conversation, right? But if you're brave, then your feelings, you'll still have the strong feelings, but they won't be overwhelming and you won't be distracted by these huge feelings that come up, right? Because the reality is that the other person may have learned not to trust other people, right? They may expect you to get angry and tell them what a bad person they are, or beat them like their parents maybe did, or tell them that God doesn't love them any. Like all these different things people can learn, these deep shame. And when you confront someone over their untrustworthy behavior, you might touch some really deep shame points or really deep fears, maybe from a long time ago in their life, right? So this is really sensitive stuff. And it's really important to help each other grow out of it. And what I have learned is to hold really good boundaries, right? Be respectful and be kind, right? And be firm, right? Many people only land on one side or the other. They'll be really firm and they'll tell you exactly what they think, but it's really not helpful, right? It doesn't bring out the best in the person. Other people will try and be really nice and just help you feel better. And don't worry, I still love you, right? But it's not firm. It's not expecting accountability. It's not holding them accountable for their behavior and expecting that personal growth. And so what I've found is it takes all these things. We've got respectful and kind and firm, so that the person can really grow from their mistakes. And in doing so, they can trust that someone else can hold good boundaries and make it safe to grow, right? So another reason this takes bravery as well, if the person refuses to grow, well, they're not trustworthy, right? They're not committed to that spiritual growth. And they're basically okay, like what they're signaling, whether they say it or not, if they're not willing to grow, is they're okay with where they're at. They're okay breaking promises. They're okay making excuses. They're okay with whatever. And that means they're not trustworthy. And so you may need to set a boundary and not trust them anymore or not collaborate in some way. And that can take bravery too. And then, of course, later on, they may recognize their mistake and commit to growth. And at that point, you can show compassion, right? Once they're really committed to that path. And the last big theme here I want to bring up is to learn how to practice bravery and actually practice it. Practice being brave. All of these things are skills. Bravery, telling the truth, generosity. These are skills we can practice. We can get better at them over time. And a big thing that causes people to behave inappropriately a lot is really big feelings come up. You're overwhelmed with fear or anxiety or stress, and you lose self-control. And all of a sudden, you'll say whatever you have to say to feel safe again. But that's not trustworthy, right? Or maybe you'll, again, people please or run away from the problem instead of confronting it, right? But if you practice bravery, one of the benefits is that you'll still feel the big feelings, but they won't be overwhelming, right? That is, I believe, the ultimate practice in bravery is to maintain self-control in any situation, maintain composure so that you can do what's right no matter what, right? And so you can tell, right? This is hard stuff, right? Dealing with my own insecurities and my own mistakes, and then dealing with someone else's insecurities and their mistakes at the same time in this conversation where I'm trying to hold them to a high standard. So it takes bravery so that we can relate to our feelings in a good way, to feel them, but not be overwhelmed, so that I can keep composure and show up in a good way. I don't have time to get into how to train bravery. I've written about it, and I can offer that in another presentation for anyone that's interested. But what I'll say here is I suggest learning it and practicing it. My first book, One Disease, One Cure, has a whole chapter on it. And I offer it in other contexts and seminars. So all that is beautiful, right? These practices can help us build deep relationships one-on-one. But you might ask, well, that's nice. But even if I can form deep trust relationships with some friends, well, then what? How can we form a healthy community, right? And how does this help us co-create a healthy nation? That's a whole different thing. Am I supposed to have deep trust relationships with thousands or millions of people? No. That's what the fourth session, the fourth video, is about. How have other people co-created healthy nations? I'll give examples and stories from the Zapatistas and the Haudenosaunee, right? People, especially the Zapatistas, who are trapped in our way of life with endless corruption and greed and discrimination and all the rest. And they built a new healthy nation, and they were able to protect themselves from all the pressures to succumb again, right? I'll share their stories and show what's possible. What makes a community healthy? How can I be part of one? And how can healthy communities unite to become a healthy nation? That is the fourth and final session in this 4-part series, Pathways to a Healthy Nation. So if you'd like to see these videos, I'll be getting a YouTube channel soon, but one way or another, they'll be available on my website, thedeepestrevolution.com/videos. And if you'd like to contact me to ask me to speak to a group, I'd be happy to do that. You can find me at thedeepestrevolution.com, or I'm also happy to facilitate different trust building activities and help people develop deep trust with each other. If you'd like to see more videos, they're at thedeepestrevolution.com/videos. And I wrote this book. The material from the Haudenosaunee and most of the material, almost all of it from the rest of these videos, is in this book, The Deepest Revolution. Excuse me, I get kind of emotional. What are healthy nations like in traditional times? And why are we trapped in this way of life? That's what this book is about. And what would it take for us to get out of this and build a beautiful way of life for ourselves? And that's The Deepest Revolution. It's a free download. There's a physical book, a print book available too, you can buy. And that's all of that is at my website, The Deepest Revolution. So thank you very much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.